Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Toshiba International Foundation Roundtable on the topic of the future of Japanese studies, perspectives from early career scholars. My name is Verena Blechinger-Talcott, and I will chair this roundtable. And before I introduce today's panelists let me just tell you a few words about the background of this roundtable and how everything came together. Basically, we had, as the EAJS, we have been working for a very long time with the Toshiba International Foundation. And the Toshiba International Foundation has been our key supporter when it comes to our work in the EAJS for early career scholars. We do, with the Toshiba International Foundation's help, we can every year conduct a PhD workshop that allows young scholars, PhD students from all parts of Europe and Japanese studies in Europe to come together and to exchange views also on their dissertation prospects, their projects, their ideas that they would not get in their own home institution. So it's also a way to help everyone network, build groups that they can then also, for example, use to bring together panels for future EAJS international conferences or other things. And also with the help of the Toshiba International Foundation, every year we can give out Toshiba International Foundation fellowships that allow early career researchers, especially doctoral candidates, to go to Japan for a period of usually 3 to 6 months, where they can do research for their dissertation, either a first field work to see whether the materials that they are hoping to be there are actually there, to do interviews, or also to work in libraries to talk to Japanese scholars and get feedback on the project. And so we have worked very closely together. We have a big alumni network by now already, people who have been either fellows or participated in the workshop. And so when in 2019, the Toshiba International Foundation celebrated its 30th anniversary, we were wondering how we could, on the occasion of this anniversary, talk about early career scholars and the development of Japanese studies. And so one of the things we did was that we had an essay contest. We invited early career scholars to submit an essay on what they see are the future challenges for the study of Japan. Because again, scholars like me who already have a chair in Japanese studies, we know what we are doing, we like what we are doing, so we may not necessarily always be the most flexible people. No? Young early career scholars are still developing their own work. They're looking at the field with fresh eyes and bring in new perspectives, and they may also see challenges that are not so obvious to those of us who have been working in the field for a longer time. I also have been told that maybe those who are towards the end of their career looking back also may have a new and fresh perspective, seeing how things have developed, where new work needs to be done. But since we are here on early career scholars, we wanted to have an essay contest here. And we actually got a total of 18 essays that were then read by a jury that was made up both of members of the EAJS and the EAJS Council, but also of the board of the Toshiba International Foundation. And so we selected winners, and the winners were then also invited to come to Tokyo. And the winners were also invited to come to the EAJS International Conference, because we thought the ideas in those essays are important, also to be discussed in the association and with our members. And I'm quite excited to see that we now have 93 people in the meeting. So this is really a topic that is of high interest to our members. So what are the greatest challenges to studying Japan? What new opportunities are opening up? And what could the future role of Japanese studies be? I think our keynote speaker, Professor Oguma Eiji, also brought that up. So how could Japanese studies also contribute to the, how could Japanese studies also contribute to the development of the field? And beyond Japanese studies, how could Japanese studies have an impact on what's going on in the various areas that are also touched by Japanese studies, being literary studies, being political science, being economics. So this is what we want to discuss. What are also unresearched or under-researched topics or fields within Japanese studies? Where do we find emerging new trends in Japan-related research? And then also, I guess that's also something important. How has the COVID-19 pandemic affected the way we are doing our research? I've been attending quite a number of panels already on the first conference days, and very often I heard, yeah, this is a project I started. I wanted to present my findings, but due to the pandemic, I couldn't actually go to Japan to collect the data yet. So here are my preliminary thoughts on this, or this is what I could find through documents that were accessible from my home country, but I really need to go to Japan to do field work to verify and also talk about this data more. So these are the questions that we brought to our 4 panelists. And before we hear their presentations, I would like to give a brief, I would like to give the opportunity to the president of the Toshiba International Foundation, Mr. Omori Keisuke, to say a few words of welcome to the group. And while we hand over the microphone, you already saw it a little earlier, we should show the images again from the award ceremony of the Toshiba International Foundation's essay contest in 2019. You see November 26, this was the time where travel was still possible. And so we had an award ceremony in Tokyo on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the Toshiba International Foundation. And you also see President Omori in the back in one of the pictures. And now I would like to give the floor to President Omori for a few words of welcome.
Okay, thank you very much, Verena-san, for your kind introduction. And good morning to all the participants. Thank you very much for joining. It's a great pleasure that our foundation is associated with EAJS as one of its long-standing partners. As Verena just mentioned, TIFO and EAJS held an essay contest on the challenges and opportunities of the Japanese studies 2 years ago, and at the time of the foundation's 30th anniversary. EAJS has made immense contributions to the Japanese studies for nearly 50 years now, and our foundation, TIFO, has dedicated its resources for more than 30 years. And we work together for more than 20 years. We mean TIFO and EAJS. However, the environment surrounding Japan in the global context has undergone thorough changes over time, including the most recent COVID-19 situations. I and Verena agreed 2 years ago to hold a joint essay contest about the future of Japanese studies, especially targeting young scholars, and to make a continued follow-up meeting, follow-up roundtable at the time of EAJS conference in Ghent, which should have been taken place 1 year ago. But now I'm very pleased that our joint vision has come to reality. I still recall that I spent much of my summer vacation of 2019 reading all the essays over and over again. I mean, 18 essays, as Verena mentioned, partly because there are many technical terms, professional terms, and many academic references that I must read to interpret the message incorporated in all the essays. and partly because I felt a sense of strong responsibility to make a fair judgment among all a total of 18 essays. The 4 panelists who gathered today are the final winners of the contest, with sharp and bright insights, and I'm very glad to see them again. If I introduce a little bit about the 18 essays, what type of essays were submitted 2 years ago, they ranged from the definition of Japan itself. What is Japan, first of all, or need for increased attention to the issues of diverse cultures, which actually exist in a generalized Japan concept, or to those who try to trace back the roots of Japanese studies in such themes as religion or philosophy by referring to the origin when these Western words like, philosophy or religion, these are imported words for Japanese. So, they're imported from the West. So how Japanese studies was born or transitioned after these words were imported. And others essay try to depart from the traditional dichotomy of East or West or, traditional dichotomy. And others noted the increasing cultural diversity in Japan, especially metropolitan areas, or others noted for the need for more, let's say, systematized theoretical methodologies universally applicable for Japanese studies. That was one suggestion in one of the essays. So today I look forward to hearing the presentations from Ike-san, Ioannis-san, Eiko-san, Aya-san, and hear their latest observations, especially after the extreme changes of the world circumstances, the academic environment due to COVID-19. In this fast-changing world, but I firmly believe the Japanese studies will continue to maintain broad significance and solid influence positions toward the future beyond the Japanese, beyond the Japanese studies for its own sake, I would say. So I'm very much looking forward to this session. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, President Omori, for your kind words of welcome. And without any further ado, I would like to hand over the podium, the digital podium, to the first presenter, which is Ioannis Gaitanidis from Chiba University. And Ioannis, I hear you have a PowerPoint presentation, so please, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Can everyone see the PowerPoint? Yes, it's okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, all right, thank you. First of all, thank you very much again for this, for the ceremony 2 years ago, which feels like a century ago, but it's now. But I was really happy that we have this roundtable to remind myself about how happy a time that was. And thank you to the EAJS for also co-organizing this today. So I'll be very brief. I have a few notes and 4 slides just to say a few words. And I was trying to find words that are new in the sense that I was looking back and I realized that the first time I tried to think about Japanese studies, it was 6 years ago. It was at a workshop of anthropology of Japan in Japan, and I called that paper "The Vicious and Virtuous Aspects of Japanese Studies in Japan." And from that time till last year, when we had the AAS virtual roundtable on the rebirth of Japanese studies, organized and curated by the amazing Paula Curtis, who I think is attending, and I think it's 3 a.m. in LA right now. Thank you for being here. I was thinking that the last 6 years, so it's more than half of my short career, I have been talking and writing about the challenges of and future possibilities for Japanese studies at a surprising rate and pace for someone whose main research interests are not in education nor in the history of academic discipline. Nevertheless, I can see now a single thread, and I think I pointed out partly in my essay, that runs through all my interventions, and that had to do with teaching So there is, of course, research, but it was for me teaching that brought me to rethink the field. And for this short talk, I'll just say a few words about this and how perhaps we could move ahead with the field in an era of pandemics and generalized precarity. So talking about precarity, as for many early career researchers today, I started my career teaching part-time at as many as 6 institutions in the Tokyo metropolitan area. And contrary to today, at Chiba University, at the time, most of my courses were conducted in English and were targeting international students who were studying abroad in Japan. And these courses were often framed, and this is, I'll show you just a bad example that doesn't exist anymore, but there were courses and curricula that were framed as explanations of Japanese ... where the dots could be replaced by words such as religion, therapies, media, politics, etc., etc. So there were at the time, of course, and still are, plenty of scholarly books to use, but the problem for me soon was that I could not offer feedback to many students who decided at the time and at the end of the course to write reports and presentations comparing what they termed Japanese ... to Italian ... or French ... or American ... And not only wasn't I knowledgeable about phenomena in other geographical areas, but I also remember being shocked at how much my in-class explanations and descriptions had been turned into molds, patterns, and homogeneous systems of classification to be contrasted with other national molds, patterns, and systems. And in fact, I clearly remember sitting in my small apartment in Shinjuku and murmuring to myself late at night while marking these reports, but I never said that. Everything in Japan is like that. Well, why did you understand that? And at the time, I felt that nothing had prepared me for the international comparisons that students were so keen upon. And I immediately understood, however, that even when not explicitly stated, the framework of many Japanese studies curricula sometimes implicitly encourage students to play a sort of connect the dots game in which they link Japanese keywords and ideas they encounter in various classes to a uniform image of something they call Japan. And students are not the only ones to blame. We do that too. I think when sometimes we go for a drink, not anymore perhaps, but after a Japanese studies conference, where we listen to a panel about a subject which we're not very familiar with, but we immediately try to find parallels sometimes, I'm not saying everyone all the time, with our own area of Japanese research in inverted commas. I was saved by this conundrum, partly saved, when I joined Chiba University. And the reason was because I was asked to teach courses using both English and Japanese. And this meant that I had to offer content based on reading material in both languages, and most importantly, coordinate debates in both languages too. And new challenges arose, but these were better and salvific. Full degree students did not recognize themselves in the explanations of some of the Japanese studies literature and were understandably unwilling to accept the use of keywords by some international students who wished to explain everything and anything in Japanese, in inverted commas. And it soon therefore became apparent that to avoid class debates turning into exchanges of national stereotypes or just ending every time with a concluding and very annoying sentence, it all depends on the person, I needed to put even more emphasis on scholarly theories and on how these can become fascinating standards of transnational comparison, albeit in the way they change and evolve in reaction to the local case studies they encounter as they move around the globe. And I remember almost the exact day when this idea finally and firmly nested in my mind. It was in September 2013, and I was preparing material to teach a new course that I called Imagining Science in Japan. Having spent the first semester at Chiba University working through the challenges that I just described, and knowing that we needed a class with more science-based content, I decided to see how I could discuss with students about the historical development of several scientific fields that are offered today as undergraduate specializations at Chiba University. And then one book that I read that summer, 8 years ago, opened the doors for me to a completely different way of teaching and thinking about Japanese studies. I'm not a specialist, but this was the book. The book was George Clancy's Earthquake Nation, The Cultural Politics of Japanese Seismicity, 1868 to 1930. As I said, I'm not a specialist. I'm not a historian, or not any of environment or nor disasters, but I still remember clearly being taken aback by the complexity of Clancy's argument. His mixture of the history of environmental disasters with descriptions of modern culturalist explanations of the scale of those disasters, the ensuing development of scientific technologies to measure and predict those disasters, the transformation of what consisted as appropriate knowledge, let's say, about architecture and masonry as the Japanese government was educating its own specialists, and a multitude of other elements made it clearly impossible in my head to reduce this book to merely Japanese studies research. So I was at once inspired to emulate that complexity in my own classes, trying to have students think about the theoretical arguments that bind us together beyond national borders, and to consider the translocal construction of everything we use to wrongly argue for national uniqueness. The COVID pandemic undoubtedly consists of a perfect material for this sort of Japanese studies pedagogy. In a new course that I started teaching last year online, I look at the development of the field of Japanese studies, and especially on how criticism against it has evolved over the years. At the end of the course, students are asked to produce an expert opinion that a hypothetical journalist has asked them to provide on the following topic. Bear in mind, I need to change the topic recently, but the topic was, has the coronavirus not had a comparatively big impact in Japan because the Japanese are very careful about hygiene? So this was purposely a topic to have students be critical about media reports. And I have to say that students' reports have been very fascinating. And it is, I believe, one of the ways to go forward with Japanese studies pedagogy. It is time to teach our students about the history of the field they are studying, and to prepare them for the increasing number of situations in which they will be asked to act as experts of the monolithic entity that SNS and the media often imagine Japan to be. The pandemic and ensuing restrictive policies have, however, undermined the environment out of which my ideas have originated. The precious presence of international students on our campus and in our classes has been reduced to nearly zero, and the classes I mentioned above, now conducted online, have mutated into these empty voids of black screens, sleepy voices, and the occasional thumbs up, the only sign that someone somewhere has been listening to what I was saying in the last 10 minutes. And perhaps they were meant to click on another like button, but anyway, who knows? Research has nevertheless partly benefited from the pandemic. Small research groups, and I have to mention this, that some small research groups that once you had to know someone who knows someone who knows someone to be invited into, are now holding Zoom meetings open to all, and online presentations by postgraduate and postdocs are really being held up every month. And this has led to various opportunities to reference, to find and reference one's work with other work outside the usual and limited occasions that we have to listen to work in the annual conferences. And I feel that this has sped up advancements in research and how we imagine our future projects could develop. For example, I'm currently co-organizing a conference on the interactions between religious, social, and healthcare movements in East Asia from the 19th to the 20th centuries, and with colleagues from all over the globe, something that I would have thought unimaginable before, especially without the financial support and without the networking that the pandemic has made possible in the last 18 months. So in the same way, and I finish my paper here, that the pandemic has opened horizons for research possibilities, it ought also to open the field of Japanese studies to the new maps drawn out by our collective fight against the coronavirus, in which we could put our skills of connecting the dots to better use. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ioannis, for a very inspiring presentation. Thank you. I would like to hand over right away to Aya Hino, who will be our next presenter. And she joins us from Germany. She's a doctoral candidate at Heidelberg University and Ca' Foscari University of Venice. Aya, please. Aya?
You're muted, Aya.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much for inviting me to this roundtable, and I'm really, really honored, especially because I don't really have a background in Japanese studies. I actually studied in sort of critical IR theories and also philosophy of knowledge. And then I worked a few years for the Japan Foundation. And then I decided to do a PhD in the field of Japanese studies. So obviously, my interest is a little bit different, for example, from my colleague just talked. But at the same time, I see some connections. So I would try to sort of explain that in my talk. But basically, because of my background, my interest is always in the relationship between disciplines and area studies, including Japanese studies. And I want to begin by addressing two of the guiding questions of this roundtable. The first one is, what are the biggest opportunities and challenges for the Japanese studies? And then the second one is, what is the future role of Japanese studies? And here I would like to reiterate what Professor Oguma said at the beginning of a keynote speech on Tuesday. If you remember, he said, the Japanese studies can contribute to the expansion of our understanding of universal issues through analysis of concrete and specific cases of Japan. And I sort of appropriate this suggestion as follows, that the potential contributions of Japanese studies is to understand how the universal manifests in the particular, or more importantly, how the particular, such as, Japanese experience or Japan, embodies and actually partakes the universal. So this means, I think, two things. First, this understanding of potential contributions necessarily questions the long-held convention of understanding universality in the sort of Hegelian fold, the idea that universality is manifested in and by a specific spatial and temporal location. And second, to question universality in this Hegelian fold is to actually reconsider the institutional categories that have notated our knowledge production, namely the division between disciplines, which has a universal tendency, and area studies, including Japanese studies, which has been sort of relegated to the realm of the particular and to the realm in which, universal theories and concepts are applied and tested. But this is where I see the challenge, because, how can we do that? How can we really address Japan or present Japan as something that partakes the universal rather than, as something that merely emulates or follows the universal that is settled elsewhere? And I know that there are a number of attempts to theorize the universal based on the specific experience of Japan, for example. The notion of multiple modernities or Asian modernities in historical sociologies, or another example would be the field of international relations and its efforts to develop sort of Japanese or Asian international relations theories. And as attractive as these attempts may be, I have a sort of lingering sense of skepticism in that, these attempts only help us to shift our attention away from singularity to plurality. So the notion of multiple modalities or Asian modalities or Japanese international relations theories, these are simply claims of other universality developed in relations to or opposition to the universality said to be embodied by the West. So for me, at least, the question still remains that, how can we talk about universality without situating it within a very specific spatial temporal location while engaging with Japan, which is also a very specific spatial and temporal locations? And, this is, of course, an open question, and I don't really have a concrete answer yet. But for the sake of the discussion, I want to offer you 2 examples which might be helpful to think about this question. So the first example is about empires and imperialism of 19th and 20th century. So Professor Oguma also discussed this in his keynote, but very, very schematically put, Japanese imperialism was basically the process of expanding the horizon of the nation with various rhetorical devices of, race and ethnicity and the nation. And, indeed, Professor Yamamuro Shinichi, he actually has conceptualized this process as Kokumin Teikoku. And Western imperialism, in comparison, was the process of expanding not really the horizon of the nation, but the sphere of influence. And, this understanding has also become analytical imperatives for the Western academies to understand empires and imperialism. So if you think about the works of John Hobson or Lenin or Schumpeter, and also the works of, for example, John Gallagher or Michael Doyle, the point of emphasis of their works varies, but there is at least a certain consensus that, through the process of imperial expansion, the boundaries of the nation, such as England or France, remained intact and stable. So in a way, let's say British Indian never became British, or people in North Africa never really became French. But does this mean that, Japanese empire and imperialism was something strange and peculiar? And, should it be treated as an isolated case, which does not really fit to the analytical imperatives of the studies of empires and imperialism developed on the basis of Western experiences? And my answer is obviously no, I don't think so. What is universal, I think, lies not in the question of what was expanding through the process of imperialism, but in the grammar of imperialism. So for example, projection of power or myth-making or mobilization of differences or economic interest or even instrumentalization of knowledge. So what is paramount here is a sort of conversation, the conversation between analytical categories derived from the Western experiences, which are often presented and discussed in the fold of universality, and analytical perspectives derived from the studies of Japanese empire and imperialism. And to understand how diachronic history of Japan or England or France in a way together embody and define the synchronicity of empires and imperialism of 19th century and 20th century. The second example is the formation of modern knowledge and its institutionalization as the university during the Meiji period. One commonly accepted story here is that Japan basically imported and translated modern and Western knowledge, and the Japanese university was established basically by putting together bits and pieces of European and American models. But here are some questions. For example, is the idea of gakumon, which what's central for the institutionalization of the university in Japan, was it exactly the same as the notion of scholarships or the notion of Wissenschaft in Germany? Also, the validity claims of, let's say, karakuteki chishiki, are they exactly the same as the validity claims of, let's say, scientific knowledge or Wissenschaft? So here we see the problem of this common story. The story somehow assumes a kind of semiotic transparency of translation from scholarships to gakumon, or from scientific knowledge to karakuteki chishiki. And in doing so, the idea of scholarship or the idea of scientific knowledge, which was obviously articulated within a very specific European context, actually abstracted from its context and endowed with a sort of timeless element with universal applicabilities. But if we go through various epistemological debates of Meiji Japan, then we realize that gakumon does not necessarily equate to scholarship, or the validity claims of karakuteki chishiki are not exactly the same as validity claims of, let's say, scientific knowledge or Wissenschaft. But then again, I don't think that this sort of incommensurability is a marker that Japan failed to appropriate seemingly universal imperatives of modern knowledge. Instead, for me, it just suggests that, what is universal about modern knowledge lies not in its imperatives, perhaps, but it lies somewhere else. For example, the fact that modern knowledge formation encompasses the nation state, or that, it's conditioned by the regime of, say, national language. So again, I believe that the study of Japan allows us to critically reconsider what makes something universal, and in effect, to reconsider the relationship between the universal and the particular, and by extension, the relationship between discipline and area studies. Lastly, I would like to quickly address another question of the roundtable about under-researched topics of Japanese studies, especially in relation to the studies of modern knowledge formations that I've just discussed. One is Kokusai Nihongaku, which has emerged recently as a sort of new vernacular to describe a bunch of new research and education programs at Japanese universities. And so far, analysis are kind of limited within the confines of, Japanese studies, and Kokusai Nihongaku is treated as a sort of new institutional development, really specific to Japan. But I think Kokusai Nihongaku has a potential to open up a new intellectual space to reconsider what it actually means to produce knowledge on Japan, and what it means to internationalize or globalize a field of knowledge. Another example is Japan's efforts to export knowledge. So, for example, JICA has been organizing various projects to establish universities in so-called underdeveloped countries, including Egypt and some South Asian countries. And, these universities are basically based on the institutional structures and pedagogical models of the Japanese universities. And of course, as Japan expert, we can simply read this as, part and parcel of soft power diplomacy of Japan. But this case of JICA is really interesting to think about the idea of the university in general, which actually has long been the object of scholarly inquiries. For example, if you think about Immanuel Kant or Humboldt, his idea of German universities, and after in the post-war period, Habermas or Derrida also discussed about this issue. And also this case of JICA, for example, has something to say about dissemination of knowledge across national boundaries. and the role of knowledge in general in the relationship between so-called developed countries and underdeveloped countries. And I'm sure there are people working on these topics, but I just wanted to sort of emphasize that these new topics, seemingly specific to Japan, can actually have a much broader contributions beyond the confines of the Japanese studies. And I think I've already talked more than 10 minutes, so I do have a few things to say about the COVID, but maybe I can leave it for the later discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aya-san. This was, again, a very inspiring presentation. And I guess the question, what is a university, will also be relevant when we talk about how universities have changed under the influence of COVID-19. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And I would now hand over the microphone and the stage, our virtual stage, to Eiko Honda, who comes to us as a postdoctoral research fellow at the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures. And Eiko has a PowerPoint presentation. And so Eiko, please feel free to share your screen.
Thank you very much. Just before I start, Aya-san, I think we have so much to talk about. I was very excited to hear your opinion. And also, Ioannis, thank you so much for the concrete models of pedagogy that you explained to us earlier. That was very inspiring. And just before I start my presentation, perhaps I should briefly explain my background like everybody else. I am a very early career researcher, I suppose. I have just finished my doctorate a couple of months ago, and a bit like Aya-san, I don't have a conventional background in Japanese studies. I did my bachelor's degree initially in art history. It was more to do with analysing visual culture, history of visual culture through philosophies and theories. And then after which I worked in the arts in London for about 8 years as a curator. And during that time, I was fortunate enough to receive Bunkacho funding to implement a series of public engagement programs, bringing together artists in conversation with various scholars of Japan, so historian of science, archaeologists, and so on. And so, my work as an intellectual historian of modern Japan develops on this background. My PhD was in global history with a focus on intellectual history in modern Japan, looking at how scientific truths and what we know as scientific truths has been impacted by and informed by the knowledge of humanities, such as religions and visual cultures, and so on. And so similar to Aya-san, I'm very much interested in the interdisciplinary conversation between the disciplines, a question of universality when it comes to the kind of epistemology we might employ to examine our human past. And so enough of that. I'm going to move on to my presentation. Screen share. So can you see my presenter's view? Can you see my screen?
Right now, now we see the present. Yes,
we
perfect.
see it.
Excellent. So I'd like to respond to the theme of the question of the roundtable as a Japanologist who specializes in intellectual history of modern Japan, but also most importantly as a member of so-called Earthlings, which is Jikujin. And so as a Japanese person who is studying Japanese studies, I'm often asked to why are you studying Japan as a Japanese person. For me, personally, I had moved around quite a lot while I grew up, and I have always wondered what does it mean to understand what it means to be a human being on this planet beyond the national framework. So my motive of the presentation very much comes from that. And Yeah, and so this means analyzing, I will be analyzing these questions historically and theoretically, thinking about the greatest challenges to studying Japan, its future form and emerging field, bearing in mind arguably the greatest challenge of the planet today, that is primarily the climate crisis and secondarily COVID-19. So in this presentation, I will briefly discuss three different elements. Firstly, the epistemological structure of the discipline and its predicament, which has been already touched by Aya-san earlier. And secondly, opportunities for the Japanese studies in the face of these challenges. And third, finally, I will briefly go through examples of research, curriculum development, and public engagement program I worked on based on the challenges and opportunities I see in Japanese studies. So firstly, the predicament of the epistemological structure. Japanese studies, as many of us know, most of which belongs to the social sciences and humanities, emerged with at least three obstacles for academic knowledge production required in the time of planetary crisis. The first two are what Sebastian Conrad argued as the birth defects, namely the method of framing our study through nation state and the limit it imposes when we research global history, and I would say also global concerns. Secondly, the Eurocentric character of the Eurocentric characters they entail. The epistemology of modern discipline derives from the European philosophy's universalized worldview, again, which has been talked about by Aya-san. And such a universalist approach has undermined the authenticity of other ways of inhabiting the world that may have a clue for us to better understand the challenges and solutions we as Earthlings, as Kyujin, currently face. And thirdly, but not the least, this epistemology, I argue, is a human-centric one. The normative idea of human here also is still dominantly represented by Caucasian heterosexual male, as it's been theorized by continental philosophers, Western continental philosophers. And all of these traits exist at odds with the kind of planetary thinking we must embrace today. So, which means respecting other people's ontological point of view and overcoming this idea of dichotomized and hierarchical worldview between Europe and the rest, and so on. And one major opportunity for Japanese studies, and perhaps this actually applies to other area studies as well, is that Japan as an area exists at the conjuncture of at least two kinds of epistemological paradigms. One is the westernized modernity pursued by the state. Another is a local epistemology that did not fully resort to the West-centric, Eurocentric and human-centric ways of knowing, while concurrently negotiating their livelihood to coexist with them. So these actually don't necessarily exist at dichotomies, rather a formal conversation exists between these different kinds of epistemologies. And the latter kinds of studies often also fall into the environmental humanities in the studies of to do with these planetary issues I discussed so far. And today, I argue that the knowledge of the humanities is absolutely essential. The climate crisis is an so-called unexpected consequence of the Western civilizational progress, where science and technologies worked without significant references to perspectives from outside these disciplines. And so the scientific failure to recognize this so-called unexpected consequence is essentially a failure of human imagination, which is studied by the humanities. Yet the hierarchy between these disciplines, the humanities, the sciences, and science and technologies, still permeate in broader academia, public knowledge, and the international policy making. For example, the most recent IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, sixth assessment report that's just been published a couple of weeks ago, that was the first of consecutive report they're planning to publish in the coming years. And at the very first of it, it had an exclusive focus on science and potential technological solutions to the climate change. And now the human dimension will be discussed in the following report I heard, but that is going to come out after the COP26, the UN Climate Change Conference, due to take place this November. And the science-first approach has been criticized by many humanities scholars, alarming approach, we call it, who work on the climate-related research. And in the meantime, there has actually been an increasing number of large-scale, long-term interdisciplinary research on climate change at major universities and research institutes around the world, where the humanities knowledge, where the group of scholars reconsider the kind of role that humanities may play in this kind of research. But the problem is, I argue, is the majorities of the research still revolve around the humanistic knowledge of the West. And this, I would say, is a huge opportunity, huge missing opportunity for Japanese studies. And now, I didn't talk too much about the COVID-19 so far, but both this pandemic and the climate crisis are planetary challenges that demand us to think and act beyond the illusion of epistemological universality and the confinement of national borders, because the climate doesn't respect borders. And another opportunity for Japanese studies in this context is a collaboration with other area studies specialists who also share these concerns. By working together with specialists of various cultural and intellectual lineages I talked about, we would be able to tell more nuanced stories of planetary lives that would equip ourselves to think and act beyond the seemingly inherent predicaments of the disciplines, that is the Japanese studies, or the humanities and social sciences. So how could we then practice this form of Japanese studies collaboratively? So this is one of the examples that I initiated back in 2017 while I was a PhD student. I co-organized an interdisciplinary symposium for ECRs that interrogated this question. At that time, the symposium was the first of its kind, as far as I'm aware, in Japanese studies, and generously funded by Japan Foundation, and it became one of the most well-attended events in the history of the Nissan Institute for Japanese Studies at Oxford. And so the enthusiasm for the symposium among the ECRs of Japanese studies, I believe, proves the possibility and necessity for this kind of field to go further. In the following years, I acted as a committee member for two separate interdepartmental projects that concerns the revision of the universalist epistemology that still permeates in our university research and curriculum development. And here I've advocated for the inclusion of Japanese studies perspectives within this context. And last year, I collaborated with an Africanist and Europeanist to co-author cross-disciplinary area studies research paper to materialize the suggestion of the revision of kind of universalist epistemology that's being utilized in the discipline of history, which is my disciplinary field. And earlier this year, a group of Japanologists, which is myself, South Asian specialist, Europeanist education scholar and artist got together to present an alternative humanities-based approach to climate change research at this conference where the UK policymakers and scientists came together before the COP26. But the, hold on a sec, sorry. Yes, and most recently, I implemented an interdisciplinary roundtable with an interinstitutional partnership for these at the Sainsbury Institute's highly successful online public summer program, which was primarily organized by my colleague Chris Hay. We had about 200 audience from over 50 countries around the world. It showed how much public interest there are in this kind of Japanese studies around the world. But of course, all of these works emerged from the process of learning, myself learning from other scholars who care about the similar challenges of the discipline. So with that in mind, together with my co-panelist, Eike and I discussed that we like to propose a new section of the environmental humanities for the next edition of the EAJS conference. Now, having said that, the biggest elephant in the room I would like to bring up as an early career researcher who has just finished her doctorate. That is the present and future of the academia itself. And I myself have been extremely fortunate to receive this fellowship at the Sainsbury Institute, albeit short term. But the virtually frozen job market and highly casualized labor, whose condition has really been worsened by the COVID-19, this is a sheer reality for most of us. And this is a fact that we cannot possibly ignore in thinking about the future of any disciplines within the academia. So our Japanese studies colleague Andrew Leelong of the UC Berkeley talked about this at the last AAS, and the as Ioannis mentioned earlier, Paula Curtis also organized a similar a panel around the future of Japanese studies, and recently Mark Pendleton of Sheffield, I think, if I recall it correctly, discussed similar issues as well. So the question remains, as we need to find out a way to reconcile with the planetary crisis as Earthlings and the ways in which we may inhabit our livelihood as precarious academic workers. And so I'm not going to, my apology, I spoke way too long. And I also wanted to mention gender equality issue that has become even more clearer during the COVID, but perhaps we can mention that during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eiko, for another stimulating and exciting paper. So this is just for the audience. It was not planned, but we definitely see that the issues are coming together, dovetailing very, very nicely between the three presentations that we've heard. And now I would like to hand over to Eike Rotz, who comes to us from the University of Oslo for his presentation. Eike, I understand you don't have a PowerPoint, so just take the mic and get started, please.
Thank you very much, Verena. Thank you for inviting me. No, I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm going to keep it quite short because I'd like to have some time also for Q&A and for discussions afterwards. And we just had three really, really amazing, thought-provoking, thorough presentations. Mine is just, these are just some thoughts. So it's some ideas. So it's not as good as the previous three, but I actually I think there's quite a bit of overlap here in some of the points. So basically there are three things I would like to take up. First one is what I perceive as one of the major challenges, which relates to the essay that I wrote for the essay contest 2 years ago. And then I'll move on and talk about what I perceive as a major opportunity or a trend which closely relates to Eiko's talk. And in the end, I'll say a few things about how COVID-19 complicates some of this. So my essay is about the lingering problem of methodological nationalism, which within Japanese studies, broadly speaking. And I distinguish between methodological nationalism and ideological nationalism or political nationalism, in the sense that methodological nationalism is a sort of tacit assumption of the self-evidence of the nation state as an independent variable or as an a priori category for analysis, right? Which basically means that within Japanese studies, we have created these subdisciplines: Japanese religion, Japanese philosophy, Japanese literature, Japanese arts, and so on, in which we quite extensively discuss what does or does not constitute religion in the case of Japan, or does or does not constitute philosophy in the case of Japan. So we focus a lot on the nouns, but much less on the adjective Japanese. So what makes something not Japanese religion, but Japanese religion? So this is something I discuss in more detail in the essay. And also that today, later this afternoon, we'll have a panel also with Yanis and with Levy McLaughlin and Lindsay Dewitt, where we discuss this issue of inclusion and exclusion in the study of Japanese religion. So I won't say so much about this right now, but that relates to that problem of methodological nationalism. And of course, this is also what Yanis was talking about in teaching practices, right? Taking Japan for granted. But instead, so what in the essay, I come with 3 suggestions that what Japanese studies can do. And the first is indeed look at discursive practices of Japan making. And that's not just state formation, that's actually also an ongoing process of nation making through both discursive and also institutional practices. Why and at what point and who decides what does or does not get classified as Japanese and what is excluded in the process, right? Now, one of the things that are often excluded in those processes are indigenous perspectives, migrant minority perspectives, perspectives of precarious groups, and so on. So my first suggestion in the essay is to look at these processes of Japan making to actually, in a similar way as scholars of critical heritage studies, for example, or critical religious studies are looking at processes of what they call religion making or heritage making, is that we in Japan, we actually look at Japan making. We don't take Japan for granted. And of course, some people are doing this and they're doing really amazing work that's being done on this, right? But I think that's sort of reflexivity. We need more of that. So we don't just study things Japanese. We actually study what makes those things Japanese, or why are they classified as Japanese and by whom, right? And related to that, of course, then is my second suggestion is that we take diversity much more seriously, not within a kind of unity in diversity type of approach that, okay, there's this umbrella, there's Japan, and then there's these local meibutsu and so on, and local matsuri traditions, and they sort of all fall within this umbrella. But we actually bracket the whole notion of Japan, and we look at diversity within on those islands that are part of the state Japan, or the Japanese territories, right? And beyond as well, things that are considered Japanese outside of those borders. So looking at border formation is a very crucial part of this. But when we look at diversity, essential is the realization, I think, that Japan is a colonial state, and that Japan has indigenous minorities in the north and in the far south, in the Ryukyu Islands and Hokkaido, that are studied by some scholars in small pockets, and some really excellent research is being done, but including perspectives from Ainu and from Ryukyu and cultures within mainstream Japanese studies, much more than we're doing today. I think that is essential. So that's one of the things that we can do by acknowledging the diversity, by sort of leaving aside the Japaneseness for a while. And the third thing that sort of also follows out of it, and sort of when it comes to questioning or critically challenging some of those border formations, is what we need much more is intra-Asian, transnational, and comparative studies, right? And I don't mean research that takes one data set from Japan and one data set from Korea and then juxtaposes it as this is Japanese so-and-so and this is Korean so-and-so. I mean, looking at actual localities and actual practices that cross borders, and that may be similar, they may be different in different parts of Asia. But a very obvious example is the often repeated myth that the Japanese notion of kami, the deities, the Shinto gods, is something that's untranslatable. And people make that claim. They place it within an East-West framework. They say the Christian God is so different from the Japanese kami, and therefore the Japanese notion of kami is untranslatable, right? But if you look in other parts of East and Southeast Asia, you see that divine beings, more than human, or other than human supernatural beings that influence life, sort of kami type. And some of them are more powerful than others. Some of them are more popular than others. Some of them are more benevolent than others. But these kind of beings that are quite immanent and that affect life is something that's widespread throughout Asia, right? and so that kind of, and by doing that kind of intra-Asian comparative research, helps us understand some of these category formations within Japan. Okay, so this is basically some of the points that I made in the essay. And if if you're interested, please have a look. You can read more there. This brings me to the second point, and here I'm very much in agreement with Eiko. What I think is very important now is that we face the crisis that we're in as humankind, but as not just humans, also other companion species and other beings living on this planet. And that when we're living in this crisis, for a long time, humanities in general and Japanese studies in particular have gone through this sort of subdisciplinary compartmentalization, right? And we see this in the organization structure of the EAJS very clearly. I think there's a bit of path dependence here, but we have these different sections. We have performing arts, we have modern literature, we have pre-modern literature, we have religion, we have philosophy, and so on and so forth. And it's all sort of very neatly compartmentalized. And then we have the big section, anthropology and sociology, that includes many, many different things for people who don't really fit within those subdisciplinaries elsewhere. And what we need right now, actually, I think generally, what's happening in the humanities and beyond is a move in the opposite direction, a move towards more, not just talking about it, but actually doing it, more cross-disciplinary research that can be really difficult, can be really challenging. But I see these initiatives are all around, and the place where we see this the most, I think very clearly and in very promising ways is this newly rapidly growing and extremely important field of the environmental humanities, which despite the name is not just humanities scholars, right? This includes social scientists, anthropologists, political ecologists, and humanities scholars, historians, philosophers, artists, but they're also trying to build bridges with natural scientists, with policymakers, people outside of academia. And that is something I think that's crucial that we Japanese studies will have to relate with, and that there are three things there, I think, how Japanese studies and environmental humanities, or how Japanese studies can contribute to this. One is, obviously, I think many historians have done this, the question of how environmental change, pollution and climate change in Japan has affected culture and society, and is affecting climate change currently as well, biodiversity loss, how that is affecting real life locally, translocally in the country. I mean, that's one thing. The other question then also, because Japan is not just a passive victim of a kind of, imposed Western modern mindset that they sort of, we will have to go along with this. Japan's also very much part of the global north. And I'm talking about state actors, about corporate actors that are fossil fuel addicts, and we see that the major Japanese corporations that are financing coal power plants in the global south, right? So the question should not just be how people in Japan are suffering or are responding to environmental change, but also how Japanese actors, corporate and state actors, and why they are contributing to this to the problem rather than to the solution, right? So that's another contribution to environmental humanities. And then the third, of course, very important, and I think this is also what EIJO is doing and what we should continue doing, how can experiences and epistemologies, alternative epistemologies from Japan, help us also rethink some of what's going on and give meaning to these things that are going on. So I very much support, this is something we discussed together. I really hope that for the next EAJS conference, I actually think we've previously had this interdisciplinary section, and it never really worked because there were so many different things, right? They lacked a sort of something in common. But I think exactly here, environmental humanities can be a way of having an interdisciplinary section that at the same time has a very core sort of main focus. So just very briefly to conclude, COVID-19, I appreciate Yannis's optimism. I'm somewhat less optimistic. I think this is a very serious challenge to the field. Japanese studies is an institutional reality only as long as we have the students enrollment that we do, because that's how, you know, academic financing works. That student enrollments are only going to be stable if students are actually able to go to Japan, to travel to Japan. They can, and the same eventually also applies to researchers, right? There's only so much you can do digitally. Intellectual engagement is one thing, but we're missing, those of us who are not in Japan, we're missing access to materials, access to sources, the ability to do ethnographic fieldwork, and very important, the sense of place, the embodied knowledge. Knowledge is not just about an intellectual engagement, it's also about being there, talking to people, feeling, about affect. And the longer, the pandemic is part of this, was the main reason, but the longer border restrictions are in place that deny access, not just to tourists, but that deny access to researchers and students, that is something that we're going to notice. If this lasts longer, that's something that we're going to notice within Japanese studies. So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for listening. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Eike, for another, I kind of repeat myself, but again, I find this highly stimulating. I also found this very powerful, all four papers together. So thank you very much. I guess the question of the new section we just take on to the general meeting on Saturday afternoon, where this will be discussed, how we handle this issue. But please understand that this is well noted and that we will certainly talk about it. For the four papers, I see that, again, they dovetailed very, very nicely. We have a number of topics that came up again and again. I think that the question of reflexivity was coming out in all four papers very clearly. And I wonder, it's not just reflexivity about the national boundaries that we are, or about the disciplinary boundaries that we are in and the national boundaries that we are in, but may also, I wonder whether we could call it kind of a double reflexivity, because we are looking at the disciplinary discussion that we're in, we're looking at our national background and our understanding of what science and scholarship is, but we also very strongly shaped by our discourse on Japan. And that's something that the EAJS has been trying to do over the last years. And Andre Bekes, my predecessor as president of the EAJS, has been working very hard to build linkages with other associations of Japanese studies, because indeed it makes a total difference if you study Japan, in Europe, or let's say in Southeast Asia or in Africa. So this is something that we want to do more, because we want to bring in more perspectives, and also that, you know, help us to understand why we are saying what we are saying and why we are seeing what we are seeing. It's not as elegantly put as Aya or Eiko may have put it, but I definitely see that this is a very important part here. The other question, crossing boundaries, is something that came up in all 4 papers. Interdisciplinary work within the humanities, but also going way beyond, going to the sciences, who claim to be not bound by national or claim to be the most universal of all of them. So in that way, I think here the third and last part for me in summing it up would be the role of the humanities and social sciences also to explain and to contextualize and to raise more questions that do not push us in our research, but also push the sciences forward more into a more productive direction. So in that way, thank you very, very much for this input. I would now like to see whether there are questions in the audience. I think so far it was quite very much in support what we have seen in the chat. There is one question on where we can find more research about, or more resources about the questions that you are talking about. That is something that could probably be posted also in the chat. But maybe here for one round for all of you, just a question. Now that we have all these findings, what do we do with them? How can we get voices heard? How can we also overcome the compartmentalization that Eike was talking about in the universities? What is necessary? Does it require a structural reform, or would also funding be an opportunity? Because I mean, right now I have a leadership position in the university, and this old saying that money opens doors is certainly one that is also an important one. So what kind of programs, what kind of funding would also be something that you would like to see in order to make this agenda that you have set up here, all 4 of you, work? So that would be a question maybe for all of you. And while I could also hand over and go back to Johannes, the question briefly: is there anyone in the audience who would raise their digital hand and speak up? I do not see anyone at the moment. So in that way, why don't we go back and do a brief round around the panel? You can also respond to each other's points a bit. And I give Johannes the right to first answer.
Right. Thank you very much. It was a very exciting discussion. I have to say, my paper, my short speech had a last paragraph that I deleted, well, at least I didn't read about in the last minute, because it was actually very pessimistic, because I finished with the idea that unless we have a VR technology that can reproduce the settings in which we teach, the online education is not going to solve the issue of Japanese studies. But my wife always says that I'm too pessimistic, so I deleted it so that it finishes on a good note. But in regards to the, I think one of the issues has always been, and even before the pandemic, this access to resources that Eike mentioned, and of course, you know, if there is a message for someone and looking for something, and we can send it on a personal level, but if there is some kind of funding, and for a very brief couple of months at the beginning of the academic year last year, various associations and digital databases, etc., became free, and it was amazing. I mean, we were in Japan, at least from April 2020 to about the end of May. It was a crazy time when we were trying to put things together for all online class, and some universities like mine didn't even allow synchronous teaching at the time. And a lot of different databases that are usually payable became free. And I think databases about journals, for example, periodicals and things like that. And that would be great if that had stayed on, because I remember myself having to produce teaching material, and at the same time trying to get the best of that 2 months window to actually download some stuff for my own research. And I think that's one thing that the funding could do something about. And this is, I think, funding this kind of huge Japanese databases that are still payable. They're behind a paywall. That's it for me.
Thank you very much, Ioannis. And also thank you for actually ending your presentation, which was the first one, on a positive note. I think this definitely was stimulating, and the full papers are also available on the EAJS website. So in that way, you can also see them if you want to read the full paper. Aya, what would be your take on the questions raised? And maybe if you want to respond to someone's comments.
Yeah, first point about reflexivities, and of course we've been, or many of us, are reflecting on Japanese studies and its relationship with disciplines, or its sort of internal division of labor. But I've been also interested in, as Verena briefly mentioned, the positionality of scholars. Like, who are we to engage with Japan, and how our background actually already kind of shape the way that we engage with Japan. And this kind of, anthropologists has long been talking about, in terms of their methodologies, but this is something that we should discuss more, not just among ourselves, but perhaps with people from other area studies, or even people from disciplines, and really think about the position of scholars. And that also relates to the position of the university, which is my sort of main interest. And one thing I'm doing at the moment, so I'm co-editing a special issue journal, on the topic of the boundaries of here and now. So of course, judging from the title, you can say that, it's really about the boundary making or unmaking, and, how people in different parts of the world negotiate or engage with boundaries. But sort of the side sort of topic of that special issue is to really think about positionality of scholars, like how we actually intervene into these practices of boundary makings. And then we are really fortunate to have contributions from Middle Eastern studies, North African studies, Chinese studies, also Indian studies, and unfortunately no Japanese studies. But it's been a really interesting sort of discussions going on in terms of the positionalities of scholars. So I'm hoping that this is something that would happen more often among ourselves as well. And another point about, especially related to pandemic and funding, and, also interdisciplinarity and stuff. So I recently read a news article on Asahi Shimbun about Osaka University and its inauguration of a new research program. And the subject is ranging from medicine and medical research to issues of fake news and information, and also issues from vaccination developments and policy implementations. So there is something really interesting happening in terms of interdisciplinarities. But then again, as many of the speakers today have raised, there's a problem of accessibility still. That, especially we as a sort of Japan scholars working outside of Japan, or, it's really hard to have an access. Then, we can think about all these digital methods or even digital humanities, but I'm not I'm a little bit pessimistic that, I'm not 100% sure these new technologies can really replace everything that, we've been using as a methodologies or as a way of engaging with Japan. So at the moment, what I'm thinking is that perhaps we need to organize this kind of discussions, not just among ourselves, but with, for example, foundations, with librarians, archivists, museum people, also importantly, policymakers. And I think we are not really good at doing that. And I'm just really hoping that, you know, we will be able to sort of organize a platform where people can get together and then really discuss, you know, what can be changed or what can be sort of implemented in order to respond to all these challenges of the pandemic. So in that sense, maybe I also would like to hear a bit from TIFO, for example, or the Japan Foundation, you know, how they are sort of adjusting to that new unfolding conditions.
Thank you very much, Aya. This is certainly something we as EAJS also should and will take up. And I guess that's a very important issue with regards to accessibility, especially in times when physical mobility is highly limited. Thank you very much for bringing this up. Eiko, the floor is all yours for your comments.
Okay, thank you. Very thought-provoking comments from other panelists. So I think I would like to respond to two specific elements that's been raised. One is interdisciplinarity, and the other is the question of accessibility. And so in terms of interdisciplinarity, as a early career researcher, that the major problem perhaps I face is that this needs to happen on the top of single authored work. So for example, my case, I guess history research paper, monograph I've been working on must take the absolute priority. And how do we sort of, you know, keep the conversation going with other scholars, not only other scholars, but scholars from other areas and studies and other disciplinary studies, and keeping that balance, because my supervisor, PhD supervisor, for example, sometimes worried that I worry that you're being taken advantage of us by senior scholars who can afford to do collaborative research, because at the end of the day, in order to get tenure track position, single authored work counts far more than collaborative pieces, unlike the science. And so there's this discrepancy between, and I do very much believe that these works are very important, and history research, that's only the field I know, but can be done in a very fruitful way without conversation. So there's a kind of fruitful scholarship one can produce when you work on it thoroughly, and by having almost a personal conversation with your historical sources. So this is a different kind of conversation, conversation with history, I suppose. And so there's definitely a need for that. For that to continue, but then at the same time, what about the evaluation of the kind of research we also need to learn to be doing in the future? I believe, which is a collaborative work, and how do we develop collegiality, not just in a way that we might develop support network, but then also in terms of its intellectual exchange and the kind of papers we could be producing out of it, and curriculum, of course. And so moving on to the accessibility issue, and so I was quite struck by the fact that how the student enrollment in Japanese studies only be feasible if they could actually go there. And that makes me think about, so not only the nationality difference and the accessibility, but also gender difference that the COVID-19 has sort of brought into light even more than ever. So yesterday I attended a fantastic panel discussion chaired by Professor Matthias Stachmann on the journal article writing. And one of the publishers said that actually during the COVID-19 lockdown, there has been a huge increase of submissions to the journals. But that's a fact. But then on another hand, another fact is that the sheer majority, there's been a study, I'm not sure about the field of Japanese studies, but the submission to of research paper to academic journals has increased among male scholars, and it has significantly stagnated female scholars' contributions, precisely because the kind of domestic expectation that we still receive in our home setting, or the kind of, also not only that, but also the kind of accessibility to mentors. And I personally have been very fortunate to be helped by scholars of all genders. But it is still a sheer reality for many young female scholars that these issues still exist. Perhaps not just young female, but like all sorts of female scholars. That the since the for example, this is I'm not a gender specialist. I'm not a sort of sociology of gender specialist, so I can't speak from that. I can only speak from the anecdotes. But for example, since the Me Too movement, there has been a certain fear and hostility among scholars who are not very, who don't feel comfortable, or who feels like they are now being policed even more. Or, you know, I have been told by some scholars that they don't, male scholars, that they don't feel comfortable mentoring female students in case they might, not as much as they do to male students, because just in case they might get suspected of sexual harassment. And so of course, I hope this is not, of course, a majority, and this is not my direct experience, but I do know that this is a reality for female scholars and young female scholars. And so how can we sort of gain the similar access to the vital knowledge and help and resources that we as in female scholars, to resources and time and knowledge that we need to be committing ourselves to academic work. And sorry, I'll try to wrap up. I'm talking a lot. And so one of the suggestions that I would like to make perhaps is that there's been an increasing number of academic publishers who has been running workshops specifically targeted to female scholars and queer scholars who may not have, who do not have similar access to this kind of help that our male counterpart tend to have. And so based on these studies. And so perhaps that's also one of the things that could happen in PhD workshops. I have been talking about that after the session yesterday with Hannah Osborne, from she's the editor of Japan Forum. What could be a way to positively move forward from this discourse of hostility and fear into more collaborative, you know, a collective, positive way to overcome this challenge. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. And Eike, you have the last.
Yeah,
in this round.
just a brief comment to what Eiko was saying about, I totally agree. I think we need more collaborative work and sort of overcome this. I think it's a very weird idea that only you know, single authored work is valuable or relevant. Quite the opposite. I think often collaborative work can produce much more better work, because you can, you know, if it goes well, if you can actually contribute and do the work together. Just fairly recently, I had a co-authored journal article with Levi McLaughlin, Jolyn Thomas, and Chika Watanabe in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. Neither of us could have done that work alone. That was really a collaborative effort. The whole idea of that journal article emerged at a restaurant in Lisbon at the last EAJS conference even. So also to say something about the importance of physical meetings. But I wouldn't say that in any way that this article would be in any way less than the kind of work I've done alone. Quite the opposite. This is something I'm very happy about. I'm very happy about the article, also because of the process and because of all the learning. So I would really argue for a culture of both when it comes to publication and when it comes to hiring, of course, because it's essential that hiring committees acknowledge that actually say, okay, we want more collaborative work, and we want to get rid of this idea that everything should be competitive and that it's individuals against each other and out competing each other and so on and so forth. So that's but that's a cultural change. I see that. I think that we need to move there, and that also, Verena, your question, like very concretely, right? What can be done what can be done to overcome this subdisciplinary compartmentalization, as I said. And it depends a bit, but I think for funding bodies like Toshiba Foundation or a Japan Foundation, one thing you could do is more targeted calls, right? Is to say, okay, we now have funding available for research, and it's specifically for projects, collaborative projects that include work in different parts of Asia, not just Japan. For example, or a targeted call that says we have research funding available for work that relates to Japan, maybe also other places, within the environmental humanities. So with that kind of targeted calls, you can explicitly invite scholars to apply with a project then that fits within it. So that would be one way that funding bodies can also be more proactive in that. The other, when it comes to internal departmental politics and faculty politics within universities, I think very often the researchers themselves are interested in meeting, having colleagues at other departments who do interesting work. Very often it's institutional limitations that even if you just want to get a colleague from another faculty to teach a class at your own faculty, then the administrators are like, no, we can't do that. Then that faculty will have to pay this faculty. You get these kind of structural impediments rather than, and instead what you could do, okay, we're going to see what we can do to make it easier for people to collaborate also within institutions, right? To collaborate across departmental and faculty boundaries. And create incentives for that. So that's more like also this has to do with university management administration. Good luck with that. And then of course, and then the EAJS, what the EAJS can do. I think we have to seriously rethink these sections, to be perfectly honest. AAS doesn't have sections. AAS has a program committee. So you'll have a larger group. You're not just two people, but a larger group of people. That then, look at, and there's going to be some, of course, labor division within, but then make a single program. And that invites more transnational, comparative, and transdisciplinary panels. And they are the ones that they're chosen. They are actually prioritized. Of course, EAJS doesn't have that same transnational character as AAS, but what we can do is sort of say, okay, do we really need all these sections the way they? I know that some people are going to hate me for saying this, but maybe it's time to renew the structure there a little bit.
Okay, I think we can talk about that at the general meeting. Also here putting in a plug for the general meeting that will take place on Saturday afternoon. So we ran over time already. However, so far we haven't really got much feedback from the audience. So in that way, I would like to ask Paula Curtis for a brief input because she has raised her hand and she has a question that we would then answer maybe also with a brief final statement from the panelists, and then we can round this up. Paula, please.
Thank you so much for letting me speak. I realize we're over time, so I'll try to keep it brief. And honestly, all of the wonderful speakers kind of hit on every single point that I would have hoped to have made. But one of the things that I wanted to reiterate, if we're asking questions about, how do we move forward? How do we make changes? And I hate to be the person that reiterates, especially that it comes down to funding, but to be honest, the kind of underlying theme that everyone has been talking about is that, to what extent can we tackle the boundaries and limits of an academic system that is hindering what it is that we do and what it is that we want to do. And often it's the universities and deans and departments that are thinking about their bottom line and they're thinking about their enrollments, and it's very depressing to think about it that way. But it's when they get the investment from funders, from outside organizations, from the government that say, hey, we are interested in facilitating and fostering these kinds of changes, these kinds of positions, that's when the administration actually steps up and thinks about it seriously. And especially on the job market right now, not only in North America where I am, but everywhere, there's this issue of the contraction of the jobs available. And even though it does ask often in job applications for transnational, transdisciplinary themes, the reason is that they want that person to do everything instead of do that thing within Japan and without Japan. And so you find yourself having almost no time to do your research and to really dig into it and to really diversify what it is that you do, because you're too busy teaching, 8 classes a year covering, modern India, modern Asia as a whole body, in addition to things on Japan. And so I do think that we need funding for research, funding for early career scholars, events that definitely support their research at the early stage. And in early career scholars, I also include graduate students when I say that. But also we need funding to support positions that call for crossing borders, crossing boundaries, crossing Asia in a way that is not meant to cover it all, but to approach it through Japan and with Japan, but also positions that don't ask for that, and that people can do focused work that isn't being forced into that broader view, but someone who is educated in being able to make those approaches while also having more focus. And so, as a pre-modernist, I'm rarely the person people are looking for in a call for transnational positions. And I think about this a lot. And this also ties into questions about public engagement as well, in the sense that we often are, and I think Aya had mentioned, like, this isn't going to replace, I don't think it can replace everything, and I agree, and I don't think it should, but in proving to funders and organizations and academic institutions that we can see beyond, the quote unquote ivory tower, we have to also think about public engagement, think about digital engagement, and also bring that to our students, because they are getting the same received narratives in the public about Japan and its uniqueness and its national identity that we are constantly trying to challenge and push them on. And if we don't engage at that level as well as in the classroom, then I think that we're really doing the field as a whole a real disservice.
Okay, thank you very much, Paula. That was a very passionate statement. I think that was more a comment than a question. So in that way, given the time that we have, maybe a quick famous last sentence or two to everyone on the panel, if you would like to add. I think this was indeed fantastic input, as Eiko just commented on also in the chat. Also with the new dimension that we hadn't talked about to public engagement. I think Eike had that a little bit in his presentation, but that's also something that we could probably pick up on in the next EAJS conference if we think about doing another round like that, given it's the 50 years anniversary of the EAJS when we meet the next time. So I think talking about the developments of the field and new trends, new challenges will certainly be something that we have to put on the agenda. And then we can certainly talk about these issues and maybe also report on what has happened in between this conference and the conference in 2 years, which I hope will be positive news. But now let's see, 1 or 2 last sentences from all the panelists. Johannes, do you want to go first again?
Right, yeah, I mean, I think Paula said everything basically. About the public engagement, definitely, as I mentioned, it's something that students ought to get ready, and this is it makes a great assignment. So I'm all for that. I'm all for that. Thanks again for the roundtable.
Thank you so much for your contribution, Johannes. And let's move on to Aya. Aya Hino, please.
Yeah, again, Paula, I think what you said was basically nicely summarized the session. But yeah, I just wanted to add, as someone who used to work at the Japan Foundation, that, you know, of course, we need to engage with them, and then we need to sort of talk about the fundings and stuff. But we cannot just ask for money, because each foundation has their own policies and their own sort of strategic, you know, ideas, what they want to do and how they want to use money, or what kind of things that they can use money for. So I really don't like the term being strategic, because it just reminds me a lot about, you know, neoliberal, capitalist, whatever. But perhaps, you know, sometimes we just need to learn the rules of the game and then just be strategic. And that's my little pessimistic word. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aya. And Eiko will be next. Eiko, please.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm not sure if I got anything to add, but you just brilliantly summed it up. I completely agree with you about funding, and also especially long-term funding. And many of the positions out there right now, if there's any at all, 1 year teaching positions, and within that 1 year, we also need to be applying for jobs, and we basically tend to repeat every year, and not having enough time and energy to do your own research, without having the time to do your own research, and then it makes it even harder to progress within the career as well. So we basically fall into a vicious circle, and but anyway, I don't want to end with a negative sentiment, but yeah, you just summarized it very well. Thank you.
Thank you, Eiko. And Eike, you get the last word.
Yeah, I just also thank you, Paula, for giving this very good comment, even though it's in the middle of the night for you, I think. But I totally agree, like transnational doesn't necessarily mean modern and contemporary, right? It can also be, and often should also be pre-modern. And also that I think we should get rid of the idea of the area specialist who knows everything that there is to know about whether it's a country, or even worse, whether it's an entire continent, but rather doing that is a sort of different way of thinking places, localities, and that transnational. Well, you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, so I think there is much, there are many opportunities there. But it's important that the university managers also understand this, and it's not going to sort of be used to make the departments smaller and smaller, and to get rid of more this specialization, right? To lose that diversity. That wouldn't be what we wanted. And the other thing is with public outreach, public dissemination, I absolutely think this is very important. There are these popular myths about Japan, and some are rather harmless and others are not, are actually dangerous. And I think one of our responsibilities is to challenge those also outside of academia, and engage more actively. And some are doing this, and many others are shying away from it, but in public debate. And so maybe one thing the EAJS could do for the next conference, in fact, is instead of an academic essay contest, but a sort of a prize or for public outreach, public dissemination, to actually, yeah, maybe a prize, the first, second, people who have been doing this in the last couple of years, to invite them and to you know, to share their work, so that as an example to others. I think that'd be really nice.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for this suggestion, which I will be happily taking on to the board. We have in Germany, the German Academic German Science Foundation, Research and Science Foundation, the DFG, has a communicator award. That is something that has got much more visibility recently. And I think that's really an important point, also giving the signs of the times and the criticism towards science and academia certainly this would be a very good suggestion. Thank you very much for that. And I think we have really gone over time, but it feels like time flew by in this panel. Thank you very, very much to these 4 fascinating inputs, also for pushing the field of Japanese studies, for pushing us as more senior colleagues and university managers to think about these issues and take them seriously, for pushing the EAJS. And I guess that's not over yet. I see that will come on Saturday in the general meeting. And yeah, keep on the great work. Thank you again also to the Toshiba International Foundation, whose essay contest actually has this all got started. So in that way, wonderful. Thank you very much and have a nice afternoon. Looking forward to seeing you in other panels and then maybe on Saturday in the General Assembly. Thank you very much.